My name is Clara Ashford, and I'm 31 years old. 8 years ago, my sister told my parents I had stolen $15,000 from our grandmother's savings account. She lied, and that single lie cost me my entire family. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. Not the lie itself, not the 8 years of silence. It's what happened 3 months ago in the mahogany-paneled office of Whitfield and Associates on Birch Street, when the estate attorney opened my grandmother's will. My parents were sitting 12 feet away from me. My mother's hand was already on my sister's knee. And when the attorney read the words that my grandmother had written, my mother's face drained of every last drop of color. She looked at me like she was seeing a ghost, and in a way, she was. Because the daughter she'd buried 8 years ago was sitting right there, alive, successful, and inheriting everything. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand the architecture of what my sister built. The structure she designed wasn't thrown together overnight. It was engineered, load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall, over years. And to understand how one lie brought the whole thing crashing down, you need to understand the foundation it was built on. I grew up in Waverly, Connecticut in a white colonial house with black shutters and a wraparound porch that my mother kept immaculate for the neighbors. Appearances mattered to Patricia Ashford more than oxygen. Our family Christmas card was never a photograph. It was a press release. Everyone smiling, everyone coordinated, everyone playing their assigned role. My sister Natalie was 2 years older than me, and from the moment I could form memories, she was the sun around which our entire family orbited. Natalie was beautiful in a way that people commented on constantly. Strangers in grocery stores, teachers at school assemblies, my mother's book club friends who'd cup Natalie's chin and say, "This one is going places." She had honey blonde hair that fell in natural waves, our father's sharp jawline, and a smile that could make you forget she'd just taken the last slice of birthday cake without asking. I was different, quieter. I had brown hair that frizzed in humidity, glasses by age 9, and a habit of reading at the dinner table that drove my mother to distraction. "Clara, put the book down. Nobody wants to eat with someone who can't be bothered to make conversation." But Natalie could scroll through her phone for an entire meal, and my mother would ask her who she was texting, voice full of curiosity and warmth. The double standard was so baked into our household that I didn't even recognize it as unfair until I was much older. I just thought that was how families worked. Some children were interesting and some weren't. I know that now. At the time, I just thought something was wrong with me. My father, Douglas, was a quieter man, an engineer who worked long hours and came home smelling like coffee and printer toner. He wasn't cruel, he was absent, which, in a house run by my mother's emotional weather patterns, meant he was complicit. He never corrected her when she compared us. He never pulled me aside after a bad dinner to say, "You know that's not fair, right?" He'd just sigh, refill his glass of water, and go to his study. His silence was a vote, and it was always cast against me. He just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. Let me give you a specific memory. September 14th, 2012. I was 14 years old. I'd spent 4 months preparing for the regional science fair, building a working model of a water purification system using sand filtration and activated charcoal. I'd stayed up past midnight for 6 straight weeks, sketching diagrams, running tests, recording data in a composition notebook with a bent spine. My hands were perpetually stained with charcoal dust. I won second place out of 247 entries. The judges told me my project showed exceptional analytical thinking for a student her age. I came home holding the silver trophy and a certificate with a gold seal, and I was vibrating. I walked through the front door and my mother was on the phone with Aunt Caroline. I stood there holding the trophy up, waiting. She looked at me, mouthed 1 minute, and turned back to the phone. Caroline, you won't believe what Natalie did today. She got asked to be the lead in the spring musical. Can you imagine? My Natalie, the star of the show. I stood there for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I counted. Then I set the trophy on the kitchen counter and went upstairs. When I came down for dinner 3 hours later, the trophy had been moved to the top of the refrigerator behind the cereal boxes. My mother never mentioned it. But the spring musical, that got a full week of celebration. New dress, flowers, a dinner at Giovanni's, the Italian place my mother saved for special occasions. I sat in the corner booth eating breadsticks while my parents toasted Natalie's talent. That was the pattern. Not one incident, not one bad day. A system. A carefully maintained hierarchy where Natalie's achievements were events and mine were footnotes. Sophomore year, I made the honor roll every semester. My mother displayed Natalie's homecoming queen sash on the mantle. Junior year, I scored in the 97th percentile on the PSATs. My mother threw a surprise birthday party for Natalie 3 weeks before Natalie's actual birthday because, and I quote, she just seemed like she needed some cheering up. My birthday that year was acknowledged with a card left on the kitchen counter. It wasn't even signed, just happy birthday in my mother's handwriting. No exclamation point, no love. Senior year was when I almost broke through. I applied for a competitive summer internship at a financial analysis firm in Hartford, one that accepted only 12 high school students out of over 900 applicants statewide. I made it, 12 out of 900. When the acceptance letter arrived, I came downstairs holding it like a newborn. My mother was at the kitchen island arranging flowers for a dinner party. Mom, I got in. The Crestfield internship. They accepted me. She didn't look up from the peonies. That's nice, honey. Can you grab the tall vases from the top shelf? Natalie's coming home this weekend, and I want the house to look perfect. I stood there holding the letter for 15 seconds. Then I put it on the counter, reached for the vases, and carried them to the dining room. When I came back, the letter was under a pile of napkins. That evening at dinner, my mother mentioned the internship, but not the way you'd expect. She said, Clara got some summer thing in Hartford, so she won't be around to help with the garden. Some summer thing. 900 applicants. 12 spots. Some summer thing. My father said, That's really great, Clara. Then my mother asked Natalie about her semester abroad plans, and the conversation moved on like a river flowing around a stone too small to create a ripple. And here's the thing about being the scapegoat in a family like ours. You don't fight it. Not at first. You do the opposite. You shrink yourself. You make yourself quieter, smaller, easier to overlook. Because if you don't demand attention, maybe you won't attract the wrong kind. I became an expert at invisibility. I ate quickly, cleaned up after myself, kept my grades high, and my voice low. I thought that if I could just be good enough, perfect enough, eventually they'd see me. Eventually the scales would tip. They never did. But I didn't stop trying, not until much later. The one person who did see me was my grandmother, Eleanor Ashford, my father's mother. She lived 45 minutes away in a stone cottage on the edge of Briarwood, surrounded by rose bushes that she pruned every Sunday morning in a wide-brimmed hat and gardening gloves that went up to her elbows. She was 72 when this part of the story begins, sharp as a letter opener and completely unimpressed by my mother's theatrics. Grandma Eleanor was a retired family attorney. She'd practiced for 38 years before closing her firm, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades separating truth from performance. She noticed things other people didn't. She noticed, for example, that at family dinners, I always sat at the end of the table, that my mother interrupted me, but never Natalie, that my father looked at his plate when it happened. One Sunday afternoon in October, when I was 16, Grandma Eleanor and I were sitting on her back porch drinking chamomile tea. The air smelled like wood smoke and the last of the late-season roses. She set her cup down, looked at me over the rim of her glasses, and said, "Clara, do you know why I became a lawyer?" I shook my head. Because I grew up in a house where the truth didn't matter. What mattered was who told it loudest. And I decided very early on that I wanted to spend my life in rooms where evidence mattered more than volume. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You remind me of myself at your age. Quiet, observant, keeping score of every slight, even if you never say a word about it. But I need you to know something." She paused, and the wind moved through the rose bushes. "The people who see you clearly, they may be few, but they'll be the ones who matter." I didn't fully understand what she meant, not then, but her words stayed with me. They would take root slowly and bloom at exactly the right time. I graduated high school with a 3.92 GPA, 10th in my class. My parents attended the ceremony. They sat in the second row. My mother spent most of the time filming Natalie, who had graduated 2 years prior and was home from college for the weekend. When my name was called and I walked across the stage, I heard a single pair of hands clapping louder than the rest. I looked up. It was Grandma Eleanor, standing in the back row, beaming. I got into 3 good universities. I chose Ridgemont, a small private college 4 hours away, because they offered me a partial scholarship and because it was the only school that felt far enough. My mother's reaction to the news, well, it's no Columbia, where Natalie had gone. My father nodded, said, "That's great, honey," and returned to the newspaper. Grandma Eleanor drove me to campus on move-in day. She helped me hang curtains in my dorm room and left a card on my pillow. Inside it read, "The world is about to discover what I've always known. You are extraordinary. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Love, Grandma E." I kept that card in my nightstand drawer for the next 4 years. College was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I existed in a space where no one was comparing me to Natalie. I wasn't the quiet one, the bookish one, the one who just isn't as social. I was Clara. I majored in accounting, not because it was glamorous, but because I loved the precision of it, the way numbers told stories if you knew how to read them. By junior year, I was tutoring other students and interning at a mid-sized firm in Hartford. My professors told me I had a gift for forensic accounting, the ability to look at a ledger and see what someone was trying to hide. I called home every Sunday. My mother answered about half the time. When she did, the conversations lasted an average of 4 minutes. She'd ask about the weather, mention something Natalie was doing, and then say she had to go. My father would sometimes pick up the extension and say, "Proud of you, kiddo," in a voice that sounded like he meant it, but didn't know what to do with the feeling. Natalie and I had never been close, but during my college years, the distance between us widened into something I couldn't name. She'd call me occasionally, always when she needed something. Could I proofread her grad school applications? Could I help her figure out a spreadsheet for her sorority's budget? I always said yes. I was still performing for love, still hoping that if I was useful enough, I'd become necessary. I didn't realize she was cataloging me. Every conversation, every detail I shared, my struggles, my insecurities, my finances, she was filing it all away. I was feeding her ammunition, and I handed it all over with a grateful smile. The lie came on a Tuesday, March 8th, 2018. I was 23 years old, 6 months out of college, and working my first real job at Hargrove and Partners, an accounting firm in downtown Hartford. I was making $38,000 a year and living in a studio apartment with a kitchen so small I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms out. I was happy, genuinely, quietly happy. My phone rang at 7:42 in the evening. It was my mother. She almost never called me, and never at night. I answered on the second ring. Her voice was ice. "Clara, your father and I need you to explain something." My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" "Natalie told us what you did. She told us everything." I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. "What are you talking about? What did Natalie say?" "Don't play innocent with me. She showed us the bank statements. You withdrew $15,000 from your grandmother's savings account. Your grandmother's money, Clara. Money she trusted you with." The room tilted. The coffee maker hissed on the counter. The radiator clanked. Everything sounded too loud. "Mom, that's not true. I don't even have access to Grandma's accounts. Why would Natalie say that?" "Because she has proof. She showed us the transfers. Your name is on them." "That's impossible. Mom, I swear to you." "Don't you dare. Don't you dare swear to me. Your grandmother gave you a key to her accounts to help with her bills, and you used it to steal from her. From a 78-year-old woman, your own grandmother. Mom, please listen to me. I help Grandma with her utility payments. I've never taken a single... We're done, Clara. Your father and I are done. We've talked about it, and we think it's best if you don't come home for a while." 4 minutes and 12 seconds. That's how long the call lasted. I know because I sat on the floor of my kitchen afterward, staring at the call log, trying to understand how my entire life had just been disassembled by a phone call. I called my father. He didn't answer. I called him again. Voicemail. I texted him, "Dad, please, it's not true. Call me back." He never responded. I called Natalie. She picked up on the fourth ring. Her voice was calm, rehearsed. "Clara, I didn't want to do this, but Mom and Dad deserve to know." "Know what?" "Natalie, I didn't take any money. What bank statements are you talking about?" A pause. Then, softly, with practiced sincerity, "I saw what I saw, Clara. I'm sorry." She hung up. I sat on that kitchen floor until my legs went numb. The radiator clanked 3 more times. The coffee maker finished its cycle and beeped. The apartment was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. Something inside me went quiet too. Not sad, not angry, just empty. Like someone had opened a valve and everything I'd been holding, hope, longing, the belief that if I just tried hard enough, they'd love me the way I needed, all of it just drained out onto the linoleum. I found out later, much later, what Natalie had actually done. She'd been in debt, significant debt. Credit cards, a car loan she'd hidden from our parents, online shopping that had spiraled. She needed money, and she knew that Grandma Eleanor had set up a small joint account years ago to let me help manage her household bills. Natalie had accessed the account. I still don't know exactly how, though I suspect she found the login information during a visit to Grandma's house, made several withdrawals, and then doctored screenshots to make it look like the transfers were initiated by me. She even changed the name on the transfer receipts. It was precise, calculated. She had built an architecture of deception, and every beam was designed to hold. But I didn't know any of that then. All I knew was that my family believed I was a thief, and they stopped talking to me. The silence was immediate and total. My mother blocked my number within a week. My father changed his. I sent letters, 3 of them, handwritten, mailed to the house I grew up in, explaining, pleading, offering to show my own bank records, to take a polygraph, anything. None of them were returned, which meant someone received them. They just didn't care enough to respond. I called Grandma Eleanor the morning after it happened. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. "Sweetheart," she said, "I know." "Grandma, I didn't take your money. I need you to know that." "Clara, I know you didn't. I've already looked at the accounts. The withdrawals don't match your access patterns. Someone else did this." Relief hit me like a wave, followed immediately by anger. "Then tell them. Tell Mom and Dad." There was a long silence. "Then, I did, Clara. I called your father last night and told him exactly what I found. I told him the transfers didn't come from your login. I told him Natalie's story didn't add up. And? He said your mother had already made up her mind. He said it was complicated." That word, complicated. The coward's vocabulary. The language of a man who had spent his entire life choosing silence over his daughter. I want to pause here for a second. If you've ever been the person in your family who told the truth and got punished for it, while someone else lied and got protected, I see you. Type your answer in the comments. And if this story is hitting close to home, please hit that like button so more people can find it. The next 2 years were the hardest of my life. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that didn't require me to feel. Numbers don't betray you. Spreadsheets don't pick favorites. I worked 60-hour weeks, earned my CPA certification, and got promoted twice. On the outside, I was building a career. On the inside, I was hollowed out. Holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving 2018. I sat alone in my apartment with a rotisserie chicken and a single glass of white wine. I'd lit a pumpkin candle to try to create some sense of occasion. It just made the silence smell festive. I scrolled through my phone, knowing I shouldn't, and saw the photo on Natalie's Instagram. The whole family at the dining room table. Turkey, cranberry sauce, my grandmother's china. My mother was laughing. My father had his arm around Natalie. Grandma Eleanor was at the far end of the table, and even through a screen, I could see that she wasn't smiling. There was no empty chair, They hadn't even left a space. Christmas was the same. New Year's, my birthday, every milestone that should have been tethered to family just floated past me, untethered and cold. I stopped celebrating them. What was the point? A birthday party for one is just a woman eating cake in a dark apartment. The rock bottom came in the spring of 2019, March, almost exactly a year after the phone call. I was walking home from work at 9:30 at night. Rain was coming down sideways, the kind that doesn't fall so much as a tack. I'd left my umbrella at the office. My phone was at 2%, and I realized, standing on the corner of Maple and Fifth, soaked to the bone, that if something happened to me right there, if I collapsed, if I disappeared, no one would know until I missed work on Monday. Not a single person on this planet would notice my absence for 48 hours. That thought didn't scare me. And the fact that it didn't scare me, that scared me. I called Grandma Eleanor from a payphone. I didn't even know payphones still existed, but there was one outside the laundromat on 6th Street, crusted with stickers and smelling like rust. She answered immediately. Clara? Grandma, I think I'm in trouble. Not the kind you can fix with a phone call, the kind that lives inside you. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, come to me this weekend. We'll figure this out. You're not alone, sweetheart. You never were. That weekend changed everything. Not in a dramatic movie montage way, in a slow, quiet, almost invisible way. Grandma Eleanor sat me down at her kitchen table, the one with the scratch marks from 40 years of grandchildren, and she laid it out plain. Clara, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. What your parents did to you wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. The money was a convenient excuse to do what they'd been doing your whole life, choosing Natalie and punishing you for not being her. I opened my mouth to argue, out of habit, out of that bone-deep instinct to defend the people who'd hurt me. But she held up her hand. Let me finish. I've watched this for 23 years. I've watched your mother dim your light so Natalie's could shine brighter. I've watched your father stand by and say nothing because saying something would cost him his peace. And I've watched you twist yourself into knots trying to earn love that should have been given freely. I'm your grandmother, and I'm telling you, it's not your fault. It was never your fault. The tears came then, not the quiet, dignified kind, the ugly kind, the kind that come from a place so deep you didn't even know it existed until it cracks open. She held me at that kitchen table while the kettle whistled and the clock on the wall ticked past midnight. She didn't just comfort me, she gave me a plan. You're going to build a life so beautiful that when they finally see it, and they will see it, they'll understand exactly what they lost. Not because you're trying to prove anything to them, because you deserve it. Grandma Eleanor introduced me to Margaret Chen, a woman she'd known for 30 years. Margaret was 61, a semi-retired tax attorney who had built one of the most respected boutique accounting firms in Connecticut. She had silver hair she wore in a neat bob, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and a laugh that could fill a room. She also had a story. I was estranged from my own family for 12 years, Margaret told me over lunch at a small Thai restaurant near her office. My brother told my parents I'd forged my father's signature on the loan application. He'd actually done it himself to cover his gambling debts. By the time the truth came out, my parents had written me out of their lives. Some families would rather keep the comfortable lie than face the painful truth. I stared at her. What happened? My father died before we reconciled. My mother sent me a letter 2 years later. 3 sentences. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please come home. I went, but it was never the same. You can glue a broken plate back together, but you'll always see the cracks. Margaret became my mentor, then my employer, then, slowly, carefully, something much more than either. The transition wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where I thought, this is my new family. It happened in increments so small I almost missed them. The first time Margaret called me on a Saturday just to ask how I was doing. Not about work, not about a client, just about me. I held the phone away from my ear and stared at it for a full 3 seconds because I genuinely didn't understand the purpose of the call. People didn't call me to ask how I was. That wasn't something that happened in my life. When I told Margaret this later, she got very quiet, and then she said, "Clara, that breaks my heart, and it's going to stop being true starting right now." She kept that promise. Every Saturday morning, 9:15, my phone would ring. Margaret Chen checking in. Rain or shine, busy or not, for 6 years straight, she never missed a week. Not once. She saw in me what Grandma Eleanor had always seen. Not just competence, but a particular kind of intelligence. The ability to look at chaos and find the pattern. To see what people were trying to hide in the spaces between numbers. Within 6 months, I was working at her firm. Within a year, I was her right hand. I specialized in forensic accounting, tracing hidden assets, uncovering embezzlement, finding the truth buried under layers of creative bookkeeping. There was a poetic symmetry to it that I didn't fully appreciate until later. My family had been undone by fabricated financial records. I was making a career out of exposing them. Margaret's family became my family. She had 2 grown sons, David, a pediatrician, and James, a high school English teacher. David's wife, Lena, was a pastry chef who brought homemade croissants to every gathering. James was single, kind, and had a habit of quoting poetry at inappropriate moments that somehow always worked. They folded me in without ceremony. There was no formal invitation, no dramatic declaration. I was just suddenly there, at Sunday dinners, at birthday parties, at the 4th of July barbecue where James burned every hot dog and nobody cared. There was one moment, one specific, crystallized moment when I realized what had changed. It was a Wednesday evening, completely ordinary. I'd had a brutal day at work. A case wasn't coming together. My numbers were off and I couldn't figure out why. And I was frustrated in that bone-deep way that makes everything feel impossible. I drove to Margaret's house instead of my apartment. I didn't even plan to. My car just went there. I walked in through the kitchen door because by then I had a key and nobody used the front door anyway. And Margaret was standing at the stove making soup. She looked at me, read my face in about half a second and said, "Sit down. Tell me." I sat at the counter and told her about the case. She listened, asked 2 questions, suggested I look at the vendor payment schedule instead of the payroll records, and within 10 minutes I realized she was right. The discrepancy was in the vendor accounts. I'd been looking in the wrong place. "Thank you," I said. "That's what I'm here for," she said. And then she handed me a bowl of soup and asked if I wanted to stay for dinner, because James was bringing over a documentary about bridges that he was inexplicably passionate about. I stayed. We watched the documentary. James narrated over it with commentary that was equal parts insightful and absurd. David texted the group chat a photo of Sophie covered in finger paint with the caption, "Masterpiece in progress." Lena sent back a croissant emoji, which had become her universal response to everything. And I sat on Margaret Chen's living room couch, eating leftover soup, watching a documentary about suspension bridges, and I thought, this is what safety feels like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of people who would notice if you weren't there, people who would come looking. That was the night I stopped waiting for my parents to find me, because I'd already been found. The first Thanksgiving I spent with the Chen family, I almost couldn't breathe. Not because anything was wrong, because everything was right. The table was chaotic. Mismatched plates, kids running through the kitchen, Lena's cranberry sauce bubbling over on the stove while David tried to fix the garbage disposal, and Margaret debated football with James. Nobody was performing. Nobody was monitoring anyone else's behavior. Nobody was keeping score. I was setting the table when David's youngest daughter, Sophie, who was 4 at the time, tugged on my sleeve and said, "Aunt Clara, can you sit next to me?" She'd never been told to call me that. She just decided. I wasn't performing for love. I wasn't shrinking myself. I was just loved. Grandma Eleanor watched all of this happen with quiet satisfaction. She and Margaret had been friends for decades, and I sometimes wondered if Grandma had orchestrated the introduction with exactly this outcome in mind. She was, after all, a lawyer. She understood how to build a case, and the case she was building, I would eventually learn, was far more deliberate than I ever imagined. During those years, Grandma Eleanor and I grew closer than ever. I visited her every other weekend. We'd sit on her porch, drink chamomile tea, and talk about everything: law, politics, books, the roses that refused to bloom on the north side of her garden. She never pressured me to reconcile with my parents. She never defended them either. She just listened, and occasionally she'd say something that I'd carry with me for weeks. "Clara, boundaries aren't walls. They're doors. You get to decide when they open." One Sunday, about 3 years into the estrangement, she handed me a sealed envelope, heavy cream stationery, my name on the front in her elegant cursive. "Don't open this yet," she said. "When should I open it?" She smiled, that particular smile she had, the one that meant she knew something I didn't. "You'll know." I put the envelope in my nightstand drawer next to the card she'd given me on my first day of college. I didn't open it for 4 more years, but I never forgot it was there. Now here's what was happening on the other side of the silence. Grandma Eleanor, being Grandma Eleanor, had never stopped watching. She visited my parents regularly. She sat at their dinner table. She listened to my mother talk about Natalie's latest promotion, Natalie's new boyfriend, Natalie's planned vacation to Positano. And she watched Natalie very carefully. Because Grandma Eleanor had looked at those bank records. She'd traced the withdrawals. She'd identified the access point. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who'd spent nearly 4 decades as a practicing attorney, exactly who had taken that money. She didn't confront Natalie, not directly. She did something far more strategic. She began asking questions, casual, conversational questions. "Natalie, how's the new car? That's quite an upgrade. Natalie, that handbag is gorgeous. Is that Italian leather?" She was building a timeline, a pattern. She was watching Natalie's spending and comparing it to what a marketing associate at a mid-level agency could afford. The numbers didn't add up. They never do, if you know where to look. Grandma Eleanor told me none of this at the time. She was protecting me, but she was also protecting her case. She'd been a lawyer too long to show her hand before the trial. Meanwhile, my life was becoming something I wouldn't have recognized 5 years earlier. I was promoted to senior forensic accountant at Margaret's firm. I bought a small house, a 2-bedroom cottage with a blue door and a backyard big enough for a garden. I started growing roses, because of course I did. I adopted a rescue dog named Huxley, a gray mutt with one ear that stood up and one that folded over, and he slept at the foot of my bed every night. I began dating a man named Thomas, a civil engineer I met through David, who had kind eyes and a quiet laugh, and who, on our 4th date, said, "I like that you know who you are. Most people our age are still trying to figure it out." I wasn't the girl my parents had sent away. I was someone who had built a life without them. And for the first time, I wasn't building it to prove anything. I was building it because I wanted to. My parents made contact exactly once during the 8 years. It was 2021. An email from my father's work address. Subject line, checking in. Body. "Hi, Clara. Hope you're doing well. Dad." 8 words. No apology, no acknowledgement, no mention of the lie, the accusation, the 876 days of silence that had preceded it. Just, "Hope you're doing well, Dad." Like he was following up on a delayed Amazon package. I stared at that email for 20 minutes. Then I closed it. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because "hope you're doing well" isn't a bridge. It's a plank thrown over a canyon and called architecture. Before the big reveal, I have a question for you. If your parents reached out after years of silence with an 8-word email, would you have responded? Type yes or no in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because what happens next changed everything. Grandma Eleanor was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January of 2025. She was 85. The doctors gave her 4 to 6 months. She took the news the way she took everything, with a nod, a question about her options, and a request for time to put her affairs in order. I was devastated. The one person who had never stopped seeing me, never stopped choosing me, was being taken from me. I spent as much time with her as I could. I drove to Briarwood every weekend, sometimes during the week. I brought Huxley, who would curl up at the foot of her bed while we talked. Margaret came too, sometimes. They'd known each other for so long that they communicated in a shorthand I could barely follow. References to cases from the 1980s, people I'd never met, jokes that had been refined over 3 decades of friendship. During one of our last conversations, it was a Thursday evening in March, the light coming through her bedroom window, turning everything gold. Grandma Eleanor took my hand and said, "Clara, I need you to promise me something. Anything. When the time comes, I need you to be in that room, at the reading, no matter who else is there, no matter how uncomfortable it is. I need you there." "Grandma, what are you?" "Promise me." I promised. She passed on April 4th, 2025, a Friday. The roses in her garden were just beginning to bud. Margaret and I were with her. She was holding my hand when she went, and her last words to me were, "Open the envelope." I went home that night, numb and gutted, and pulled the envelope from my nightstand drawer. My hands were shaking. I slid it open with my thumbnail. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream stationery in Grandma Eleanor's handwriting. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then the time has come. I want you to know that I have spent the last several years ensuring that the truth, all of it, will come to light. I've documented everything: the real bank records, the access logs, Natalie's spending patterns, the private investigator's findings. Every piece of evidence is with my attorney, Harold Whitfield. He has my instructions. All you need to do is show up. You've spent your whole life trying to be seen. Now you will be. I love you more than these old roses. Grandma E. I read it 3 times. Then I sat on the floor of my bedroom, holding that letter, and I cried. Not from grief, though there was grief. From being known. Truly, completely, exhaustively known. She had seen me. From the very beginning to the very end, she had seen me. And she had spent years, quietly, methodically, building the case that would finally force everyone else to see me too. That's not revenge. That's not drama. That's architecture. The will reading was scheduled for May 12th, 2025, 10:15 in the morning. Harold Whitfield's office on Birch Street, a converted Victorian with creaking floors and built-in bookshelves stuffed with leather-bound case reporters. I arrived at 9:45. I wore a navy blue dress that Margaret had helped me pick out, and the pearl earrings Grandma Eleanor had given me for my college graduation. My hands were steady. My heart was not. Thomas had offered to come. I told him I needed to do this alone. Margaret was waiting in her car outside in case I needed her after. Huxley was with David and Sophie, who had promised to give him extra treats. I walked into the conference room and there they were. My mother, my father, Natalie. 8 years. 8 years since I'd been in the same room as these people. My mother looked older. Her hair was more silver than blonde now, and the lines around her mouth had deepened. My father had lost weight. He looked diminished somehow, like someone had let some of the air out of him. Natalie looked exactly the same. Same honey blonde hair, same practiced smile, same way of tilting her head when she was performing for an audience. My mother's eyes went wide when I walked in. She actually flinched. I don't think she expected me to be there. Or maybe she expected the Clara from 8 years ago, the quiet one, the shrinking one, the one who would sit at the end of the table and make herself small. I sat across from them. I didn't speak. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Harold Whitfield entered the room carrying a leather portfolio and a second, thicker folder. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the deliberate calm of someone who had overseen hundreds of these meetings and understood that his job was to deliver the truth, not to soften it. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I'll begin with the reading of Eleanor Grace Ashford's last will and testament, dated February 3rd, 2025. My mother shifted in her chair. Natalie crossed her legs. Harold opened the portfolio. Mrs. Ashford's estate consists of the following: the property at 14 Briarwood Lane, including the house, the 1.2-acre lot, and all contents therein. A brokerage account valued at approximately $478,000. A savings account containing $112,000. Various personal effects, including jewelry, artwork, and a collection of first edition legal texts valued at approximately $35,000. The total estimated value of the estate is approximately $860,000. I watched my mother's face calculate. I could see it, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes moved. She was already dividing. Harold continued. Mrs. Ashford's will is explicit and detailed. I'll read the relevant sections verbatim as she requested. He cleared his throat. To my son, Douglas Ashford, I leave the sum of $1. This is not an oversight. It is a consequence. For 23 years, I watched you choose silence over your younger daughter. I watched you let your wife diminish Clara's accomplishments, dismiss her feelings, and ultimately discard her based on a lie you never bothered to investigate. Silence isn't neutrality, Douglas. It's a choice. And you chose wrong. My father's face went white. His hands, which had been resting on the table, began to tremble. To my daughter-in-law, Patricia Ashford, I leave nothing. You were never entitled to my estate, and your treatment of my granddaughter Clara removed any goodwill I might have extended. My mother's mouth opened. No sound came out. To my granddaughter, Natalie Ashford, I leave the sum of $1. Additionally, I direct my executor to provide to all parties present a copy of the attached investigative report documenting the true source of the $15,000 withdrawal from my savings account in March of 2018. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has weight. Harold opened the second folder. He placed a stapled document in front of each person at the table. I watched Natalie's face as she looked down at the first page. The color drained from her cheeks. Her practiced smile evaporated like steam. This report, Harold said, was compiled over a period of 3 years by a licensed private investigator at Mrs. Ashford's direction. It includes bank access logs, IP address records, transaction timestamps, and Natalie Ashford's personal financial records obtained through lawful means. The evidence conclusively demonstrates that the $15,000 withdrawal was made by Natalie Ashford, not Clara Ashford. Furthermore, the screenshots presented to Douglas and Patricia Ashford in March of 2018 were digitally altered. My mother looked at Natalie. Natalie didn't look up. She was staring at the document like it was written in a language she couldn't read. Finally, Harold said, turning back to the will, to my granddaughter Clara Eleanor Ashford, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate. The house, the accounts, the personal effects, everything. Clara, you are the granddaughter who saw me for who I truly was, not for what I could give you. You are the one who showed up, who called, who drove through the rain to sit with an old woman and drink tea. You are the one who never stopped being kind, even when the world gave you every reason to be bitter. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. Build something beautiful with this, sweetheart. You've earned it. I couldn't move. The words swam in front of me. I pressed my fingertips into the table to keep myself anchored. I wasn't going to cry. Not here, not in front of them. My mother found her voice first. This is outrageous. Harold, she manipulated Eleanor. She must have. An 85-year-old woman, alone, vulnerable. Harold raised his hand. Mrs. Ashford, Eleanor was evaluated by 2 independent physicians in February of this year. Both confirmed full cognitive capacity. Additionally, this will was drafted in consultation with myself and 2 witnesses. It is not contestable on grounds of undue influence. My mother turned to me. Clara, you have to understand. We didn't know. We believed Natalie because it was easier, I said. My voice was calm. I hadn't planned to speak, but the words came out with a steadiness that surprised me. It was easier to believe I was a thief than to question your golden child. It was easier to cut me off than to look at the evidence. You didn't call the bank. You didn't ask to see my records. You didn't even give me the chance to defend myself. You just believed her, because you always believed her. Clara, please. I'm not angry, Mom. I was angry for a long time, but I'm not anymore. I'm just clear. You chose Natalie because choosing Natalie was comfortable. And now you're sitting in this room, finding out that the daughter you threw away was the one who was telling the truth the entire time. My father spoke for the first time. His voice cracked. Clara, I'm sorry. I was a coward. I've always been a coward. I let them make you feel like you didn't matter. I looked at him, the man who used to smell like coffee and printer toner, the man whose silence had been a verdict rendered without a trial. I know, Dad, and I'm sorry too. I'm sorry that it took Grandma dying for you to say that. Natalie still hadn't spoken. She was gripping the investigative report so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Finally, without looking at anyone, she said, I was in debt. I didn't know what else to do. You could have asked for help, I said. You could have told the truth. Instead, you stole from an 80-year-old woman and framed your sister. And then you watched for 8 years, Natalie, while I lost everything. You watched me get erased from this family, and you sat in my chair at the dinner table, and you never said a word. I didn't think it would go this far. It went exactly as far as you let it. The room was quiet again. Harold stood, gathered his papers, and said, I'll give you all a few minutes. If anyone has questions about the estate administration process, I'll be in my office. He left. The 4 of us sat in that room, my mother staring at the table, my father silently crying, Natalie frozen, and me, somehow, the calmest person in the room. I realized in that moment that I had spent my entire life being afraid of this confrontation, afraid of being in a room with these people and speaking the truth. And now that it was happening, it wasn't terrifying at all. It was just quiet. Like setting down something heavy you've been carrying for so long, you forgot what your shoulders felt like without it. I stood up. I don't hate any of you. I want you to know that. But I'm not going to pretend that this can be fixed with a conversation in a lawyer's office. You didn't lose me because of an argument or a misunderstanding. You lost me because you never valued me enough to question the lie. I walked to the door. My mother said, Clara, wait. I turned. Will you let us try? I looked at her for a long time. The woman who had moved my science trophy behind the cereal boxes. The woman who had blocked my number. The woman who was now asking for a door she'd spent 8 years bricking shut. Apologies are a starting place, Mom, not a finish line. And right now, I'm not sure you've started yet. I walked out. Margaret was waiting by her car. She didn't ask how it went. She just opened her arms, and I walked into them, and I let myself breathe. The aftermath unfolded slowly, the way all real consequences do. My mother called me 3 days later. I didn't answer. She called again the next day and the next. She left voicemails, long, rambling, tear-soaked voicemails that veered between apology and justification. We didn't know, Clara. How were we supposed to know? As if not knowing was the same as not being responsible for believing. Natalie sent me a letter, handwritten, 3 pages. It was more honest than I expected. She wrote about the debt, about the panic, about how she'd convinced herself the lie was temporary, that she'd pay the money back and no one would ever know. She wrote about watching me disappear from the family and feeling relief that was immediately followed by guilt that she buried deeper and deeper every year until it calcified into something she couldn't access anymore. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she knew she didn't deserve it. That was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. My father showed up at my door 3 weeks after the reading. He stood on my porch in a wrinkled polo shirt, holding a plant, a rose bush, still in its nursery pot. His eyes were red. Huxley barked once, then sat down and tilted his head. "I don't know if this is the right thing," he said. "I don't know if anything I do now is the right thing. But your grandmother, she was right about me. I was a coward. I chose peace over you, and I've had to live with that. I can't undo it. I know that. But if you ever want to, if there's ever a day when you want to try, I'll be here, and I won't be silent this time." I took the rose bush. I told him I needed time. He nodded and he left, and I stood on my porch holding that plant and watching his car disappear down the road. It was the longest conversation we'd had in 8 years, and it was only 45 seconds. I planted the rose bush in my backyard, next to the ones I'd already been growing. Grandma Eleanor's roses, the ones I'd transplanted from her garden after she passed. They were blooming now, red and pink, and one stubborn yellow one that refused to follow the pattern. I put my father's rose bush at the end of the row, not in the middle, not yet, but in the ground. The extended family found out, of course. These things don't stay contained. Aunt Caroline called me, sobbing, saying she'd always known something wasn't right, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Cousins reached out on social media. My mother's book club dissolved, reportedly, after word spread about the will reading. 3 families quietly uninvited my parents from the neighborhood 4th of July party. Social consequences are slow, but they're thorough. Natalie lost her job 4 months after the will reading. Not directly because of the revelation, but because the unraveling of her carefully constructed image created fractures that spread into every area of her life. Her boyfriend of 2 years broke up with her after she finally told him the truth. Not because she wanted to, but because the investigative report was now a matter of semi-public record, and she was terrified he'd find out from someone else. He told her, apparently, that he couldn't be with someone who had done what she'd done and then watched it happen for 8 years without speaking up. The lying I could maybe understand, he said. The 8 years of watching your sister suffer, that's who you are. My mother went through what I can only describe as a public reckoning. Waverly is a small town. People talk. The women in her book club, the neighbors on our street, the couples they'd shared dinners with for 2 decades, they all found out in the way small town information travels, slowly, then all at once. My mother had spent 30 years cultivating an image of the perfect family, the perfect mother, the perfect home. And now everyone knew that the foundation of that image had been built on the erasure of her younger daughter. Some people were sympathetic. Most were not. When you spend 3 decades performing perfection, people don't feel sorry for you when the curtain falls. They feel vindicated. My father retired early. He told me later, during one of the cautious, halting phone calls we began having in the months that followed, that he couldn't face his colleagues anymore. Not because they knew about the will, because he knew about himself. I sit at my desk, he said, and I think about all the times you called and I didn't pick up. I think about the letters you sent that I read and put in a drawer. I read every single one of them, Clara, every one, and I did nothing. Why? I asked. A long pause. Because doing something meant admitting your mother was wrong. And admitting your mother was wrong meant the last 25 years of our marriage had been built on something I couldn't look at. So you sacrificed me instead. Yes. His voice broke on the word, just cracked, like a branch that's been holding too much weight for too long. Yes. And I will spend the rest of my life knowing that. As for the estate, I kept the cottage in Briarwood. I didn't sell it. I couldn't. Instead, I spent weekends that summer cleaning it out, room by room, finding pieces of Grandma Eleanor everywhere. Her reading glasses on the hall table, her gardening gloves by the back door, still creased to the shape of her hands. A photograph of me at 14 holding my science fair trophy, framed and sitting on her bedroom dresser. She'd kept it all those years in a place of honor. I'm sitting on that porch now as I tell you this. The chamomile tea has gone cold. Huxley is at my feet. The roses are in full bloom. Thomas proposed last month, on this porch actually, because he knew it was the place where I first learned what it meant to be loved without conditions. Margaret cried. David brought champagne. Sophie, who is now 9, told everyone at school that her Aunt Clara was getting married. My parents were not invited to the engagement dinner. That's not revenge. That's not cruelty. That's a boundary. There's a difference. I'm not closing the door, but I'm the one who decides when it opens. And right now, I'm still learning what it feels like to live in the open air after spending so many years in a room with no windows. It turns out that healing isn't a single moment. It's not a speech or a will reading or a confrontation. It's the Tuesday nights when Thomas cooks dinner and Huxley steals a piece of chicken off the counter, and we laugh so hard the neighbors probably hear us. It's the Sunday mornings when I drive to Briarwood and prune the roses the way Grandma Eleanor taught me. It's the quiet knowledge that I am surrounded by people who chose me, not because of what I could do for them, but because of who I am. If this story touched you in any way, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to build your own family because the one you were born into couldn't see your worth? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat, the one who told the truth and got punished for it, the one who was too quiet, too different, too inconvenient for the story your family wanted to tell, I need you to hear something. You were never the problem. the system was. And walking away from a system that was designed to hurt you isn't betrayal. It's survival. You have the right to build your own table, to choose your own family, to plant your own garden and watch it bloom on your own terms. That's not revenge. That's not drama. That's just living your life. And you deserve it. I found my people, and I hope you find yours too. Grandma Eleanor, if you're listening, the roses are beautiful this year. Every single one.